Since 2022, we have seen how the Russian shadow fleet operated with total impunity towards the law. If a tanker were to have gotten caught, the owner could always dissolve the shell company and keep sailing. It was a cat and mouse game, but the mouse was always wearing a mask. But today that game has changed because the cat has finally gotten claws. On January 22nd, we saw the sanctuary of the high seas stop feeling like such a sanctuary. French commandos boarded the tanker Grinch, and the captain ended up in custody. Now, for years, the risk of being caught was only a technical thing, it was paperwork. But today, that risk translates into a jail cell. That single shift breaks the entire business model. A shell company cannot feel fear, but a crew, it most certainly can. And when the man on the bridge can be detained, the corporate wrapper stops protecting anyone. The shadow fleet is no longer a trade dispute. It is beginning to look more and more like a military objective. Every voyage turns into a personal gamble for the crew, not just a legal trick for the owner. But in Moscow, this reads as a stability threat. Because in Russia, they know what the future is without oil. There is no future without oil. So today, you can be certain panic is spreading inside of Moscow. My name is Dr. Jason Smart. I'm a national security advisor and a Kiev Post special correspondent. The situation right now for Russia is complex, and it's getting no less difficult because right now, Russia has lost what it had counted on being able to use. It saw for the past few years that nobody was going to do anything about sanctions. It could continue just to sail through the seas and sell its oil. But if that jig is up, what does that mean? How will Russia be able to afford to keep going? And the answer is very simple. They don't have a clear plan because Russia without oil offers the world very little. But today, there's less demand for Russia's oil, which means there's less need for Russia. So if you don't already, subscribe now and become a channel member if you'd like the latest briefings as to what's really happening globally. So first and foremost, you have to understand that what we are seeing transpire is a direct hit on the entire conversion chain of Russian war power. Oil money becomes war money only after it is able to clear the physical choke points of the world. The Kremlin today needs the cash to keep the machine running, and today it is already failing. With over 1.2 million casualties, the regime cannot afford a treasury that's broke. And today we see, even more bloody perhaps than the battlefield, is what is happening to Russia's economy. Of course, Russia is always dependent on the fact that you can rename shell companies. But what do you do if all of a sudden your ship becomes seized? Replacing a massive vessel, that takes years with the current restrictions. But more than that, it's going to be very difficult for Russia to figure out other solutions. A seized ship, in fact, breaks the entire survival math of the Putin regime, which is where people get it wrong. Many people miss on the fact that the squeeze is not only about the Americans or the French boarding your ship, it's also about insurance, documentation, and whether anyone will accept your papers. So you can have a printed certificate, but it doesn't mean that everybody will accept it. European authorities have pushed, in fact, for tighter requirements for proof of insurance and reporting in their waters. Shadow operators can waive their documents all they want, but if the coastal states do not accept those papers, well, there comes the inspectors. There come the authorities. And in Moscow, this reads as a trap that keeps tightening because the fleet cannot hide from paperwork forever. Sooner or later, you will get caught. So today, this also signals something even more important. It signals for the entire underworld that now there's attention on them. But look at the Americans with Operation Southern Spear. That was a signal that the United States is willing to do more than just issue more sanctions. It's willing to actually seize ships. And today, we see that there is this effort in both hemispheres. And there's an entire message that's gone out now to the global underworld. The sanctuary, it's gone. It's no longer going to operate like that. Peacetime sanctions are over. Today, there is active maritime conflict. And interdiction risk forces buyers to demand deeper discounts on the Russian crude. Discounts, they bleed the treasury. And the treasury pays for everything that keeps the regime calm. Now, Moscow can tolerate a discount for a month, maybe a little bit longer, but a permanent discount, that changes all their calculations. That's something they had not expected. And because this is so very important, the Kremlin chose one of its top people to handle this file. Which reminds me, please check out the first pinned comment below with the question of the day and with a really great video you should check out. But right below that, you'll see how you too can help the Ukrainian soldiers get the supplies they need to survive this cold winter and to help Ukraine defeat Russia. Thank you. Nikolai Patrushev is Vladimir Putin's old KGB colleague. He is considered to be a hardline ideologue, but this is the man that Russia chose to be in charge of shipping. His background: he's a former director of the Federal Security Service of Russia, the FSB, and he was in charge of the Security Council for many years. He is the referee between the generals, the spies, and the oligarchs. But Vladimir Putin chose him because the Shadow Fleet is now a single point of failure. When the treasury is at risk, you're not going to just send some banker, you're going to send an executioner. Patrushev's presence signals that shipping is now considered a strategic state security matter for the Kremlin. Patrushev knows exactly how to punish people, whom to punish, and he knows how to keep the system functioning despite the panic. But his appointment also tells the world that the Kremlin is prepared to use force to move its oil. But there's something even more interesting about this. When we look at what we saw just on January 29th, we saw that Patrushev visited the Maritime Security Center in Muscat, Oman. Oman matters a lot in this world of shippings because it is so near the lanes and the back channels that keep cargo moving. It acts as a quiet laundromat for sanctioned trade in the region. And Muscat, it wants to remain a neutral hub. Moscow, though, wants a permanent logistics anchor. This visit, though, it signaled a new priority: naval protection deals for the Shadow Fleet, which is sort of funny because when you think about it, if you're openly discussing escorts for your tankers, it's probably a very safe bet to say that you don't feel secure. But it's also safe to say that the entire world realizes that your invisible fleet is already not so invisible. But escorts turn every tanker into a moving military target, and the Russian Navy cannot afford to use combat ships as private oil guards. Every escort mission steals hulls from deterrence patrols. It takes away from Russia's readiness. And in Moscow, this reads as a brutal choice: combat power or export security. And that choice pushes the Kremlin deeper into the underworld. If the Navy cannot protect oil, Moscow leans harder on the smugglers. Sanction systems, they overlap. And today, Russia is working with a host of different organizations, a host of different illegal actors. These people are not good people, but that's how Moscow found them. They all have a common interest: how they can beat sanctions, how they can beat the law. But Patrushev's presence also hints at a palace move. There's something that goes on here that's important if you want to understand how the Kremlin operates and the Putin regime. When a hardliner controls the export artery, he controls the budget, which means he controls loyalty. Shipping becomes political leverage, and that is very important inside of the Kremlin. Now, Patrushev's son, Dmitry Patrushev, he's worth remembering, as is his father, because he's very important. Dmitry has probably known Vladimir Putin since he was born. Quite literally, his father and Putin were friends since the 1970s. But Dmitry seems to have a very good perspective for the future. He's a deputy prime minister. He's a former minister of agriculture. His lover is the minister of agriculture, and together they're estimated to have hundreds of millions of dollars. But most likely, it's even more. But Dmitry matters for a different reason as well. There's a lot of speculation that he will take over after Putin. So if Dmitry Patrushev were to take over after Putin, it makes a lot of sense that today his father is helping to make sure that they have already a corner on the market. But today we see that it's going to be harder and harder. But Moscow is facing a lot of challenges. Globally, we've talked about its partners that are no longer able to help it. But just look at one of the other neighbors of Russia. Look at Central Asia, which Russia refers to as the near abroad. In reality, it is the front line of a shrinking Russian empire. That region consists of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. I myself spent 4 years living in Kyrgyzstan and working often in Kazakhstan. So they are bounded together by a common Soviet past and a Russian language footprint. But today, they've realized they don't really need Russia either. And that's something that Russia worries about. They try to influence them. They want to have their ability to put their stamp on them. But they've got some competition. There is now a rising Wahhabist influence that we see in the region. It's something that Moscow can't compete with. Somehow the Russian world, it's not great competition when you're up against Wahhabists in Central Asia. But there's something even more important. China is winning the economic war there. They've put in over $66 billion. And today, Beijing is building its trade with the region. And as it does so, it's also building corridors. Those corridors are making the future much more Chinese oriented. However, it's not just the Chinese and the Wahhabists who take a strong interest in Central Asia. Turkey is a country that is quite important regionally. It doesn't get as much attention in the West, certainly not in the United States, but it has done a lot globally to reach out to other countries that have a Turkic background. The Kazakh language, the Kyrgyz language, Turkmen language, Uzbek languages are all from the same language family as is Turkish. In fact, I taught at a Turkish university in Central Asia for a couple of years while I was working there. But I digress. So in Moscow, this all is a very bad sign. These countries in Central Asia realize that their future, it's not going to look very good with Russia. They saw what happened to the Ukrainians. They're brotherly neighbors. So if that's what they do to the Ukrainians, people whom they call brother, how do you think that they believe the Russians will treat them? Why would they possibly believe that the Russians are going to treat them well? Today they're turning the other direction, but that is something that is speeding up right now. Now, why that is so relevant to what we're talking about today, about this war, is because today Russia is being cut out of Central Asia, including in transport. We see the Turks are trying to find new ways to do transport between their countries and not have to go through Russia. The Chinese are doing the same thing. Now, by cutting Russia out totally, imagine what the future looks like. Today we're talking about the Shadow Fleet, but tomorrow, that means that for Russia, its ability to do trade globally is being diminished by the day. But there's another aspect of this that's very important. Russia historically would have stepped in when it saw things like we're seeing today in Central Asia occurring, but Russia doesn't have the capacity. It doesn't have the military capacity. It doesn't have the cash capacity. It can do nothing, despite the fact these neighboring countries are so very small. So overall, for Russia, we see a lot of signs that things are not going well. Vladimir Putin's first instinct, undoubtedly, would try to be to reinsert Russia to the region. But when that's no longer an option, then what does he do? Putin today is in a bad way. And here's why it'll get even worse. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.